The Johnsons had already been bombed out of their home back in December, and Margaret had just moved most of her large family into a new, smaller house on Wycombe Street. But it wasn't big enough for all of them. 2 of the children were living with relatives nearby.
On the night of the 3rd of May, she'd been in an air raid shelter with 3 of her children when it received a direct hit. Margaret had been pulled from the remains of the shelter and taken to a nearby hospital, but her 6-month-old baby daughter had died in the blast. And there was no sign of 15-year-old Peter or 7-year-old John.
On the morning of the 4th, as Margaret lay unconscious in a hospital bed, her younger sister Frances volunteered to go looking for the missing boys. Frances's daughter, also called Frances, remembers the story of that day.
Mum was 19. Mum was the second to youngest, but Mum was the strongest. She was like the shepherd of the family, if you like. She seemed to be able to rise above everything and sort them all out.
Frances set off to find her nephews, taking Margaret's other son, 13-year-old Jimmy, with her. He'd been staying at her house the night before.
Frances and Jimmy, they went together looking round everywhere, hospitals, looking for the 2 boys.
Out on the streets of Liverpool that morning, this is what they'd have seen.
In the aftermath of the worst night of bombing Liverpool had ever experienced, unsurprisingly, chaos reigned. No one knew which hospitals were open or where survivors and bodies were being taken.
Frances and Jimmy would have begun their search close to home, most likely with their local hospital on Stanley Road. But after a night of bombing, the hospital was in chaos. So Frances and Jimmy widened their search, trekking from district to district, asking around in hospitals and first aid posts, anywhere the missing boys might have been taken.
My mum was absolutely frantic searching for these children because my mum was very attached to Margaret. We were very, very close.
All morning, Frances and Jimmy scoured the city for news of Margaret's boys. Then, at some point during that day, they were given a new lead. Some of the casualties had been taken to the east of the city, so Frances and Jimmy hurried there as fast as they could.
So she went up to a place in Wavertree, which was an old cinema, the Cameo Cinema. And it was turned into a temporary mortuary. They were all laid out on the stage.
One by one, Frances and Jimmy checked the bodies lying on the stage.
And Mum found John.
John was already dead. I think of Frances as well, that night, because she was a 19-year-old girl. Having to trawl through there looking for her nephews, you know, it just doesn't bear thinking about. It doesn't bear thinking about what they went through.
My mum was so traumatised, she just couldn't talk to anybody about it.
But among all the bodies in the cinema, there was no sign of Margaret's other missing son. There was still a chance that Peter might be alive. After hours of searching, Frances and Jimmy decided to give their local hospital, Stanley Road, one more try.
As she passed a shop on Stanley Road, she saw this air warden sitting on the floor in the doorway of the shop with a cigarette in his hand. So she went up and she called over to him. Is there any news yet about the children? She must have known him. She didn't get a response, so she went over and touched him, and he fell forward, and he was dead, and his back was just split open. My mum went on then to the hospital to check again to see if there was any sign of Peter.
But Stanley Road Hospital was still in a state of chaos.
Stanley Road Hospital took a hit that night and the electrics were out.
She'd only been in the hospital a short while. Everywhere was thrown into darkness.
Francis and Jimmy dashed around, making inquiries about Peter.
She couldn't find him.
But once they got the electrics up and running again, Stanley Hospital functioned.
Now the lights were back on, the search was easier. Amongst all the wards full of casualties, Francis and Jimmy saw a face they recognised.
Peter was there in hospital.
After scouring the whole city, they'd ended up finding Peter in a hospital just a few streets from their bombed-out home.
Peter was badly injured, but still alive. On the 10th of May, 6 days after her home had been hit, her 15-year-old son Peter died of his injuries. Margaret was distraught. John, little baby Margaret, and now Peter had all been lost.
All she was left with were photographs of her sons. Margaret pawned her wedding ring to have them made into special keepsakes, which are now kept in the Museum of Liverpool. These are Margaret's ornamental mirrors, imprinted with photographs of John and Peter.
I can't possibly imagine just how much value these must have held for Margaret. You have to remember, this is at a time way before we all had the ability to easily snap photos of each other.
Because of the war, Margaret never managed to get a photograph of her baby daughter. The family say she kept the mementos of the boys on display for the rest of her life.
These must have been such precious possessions for her, and a means of keeping the memory of the children she lost alive.
The sadness that I felt about it all was for me Nana, to think what she went through, to be bombed out twice, to lose 3 children.
I don't think she ever got over that. She didn't like to talk about it because this was the only trauma in the family. Everybody else survived the Blitz and the war. So, you know, this was something that must have knocked them all for 6.
Every year, a member of the Johnson family lays flowers in Anfield Cemetery, where the boys are buried in a communal grave for victims of the Blitz.
Some people go into the doldrums, but me Nana, she picked herself up, got on with it, and became a very strong woman.
Along with her 3 surviving children, Margaret went on to have another little girl born in 1942. She stayed in Liverpool with her close-knit family, becoming grandmother to 8 grandchildren. She died in 1987, aged 83.
I always remember that the morning she died, I wasn't there. You were all at the hospital,
there, yeah.
I didn't think, I've lost my grandmother. I thought, I've lost my best friend here. And that's the way she was. Best friend to me.